anyone can be a leader. It's a deeply human activity. It comes from the way we walk in the world, and at its heart is dignity and respect and vulnerability, that vulnerability is strength. And if you walk in a way which respects our shared humanity, that's for me the definition of leadership.
It's Sydney in the late 90s. Liz Broderick has just made partner at a big commercial law firm. She's also 36 and decides she's ready to have kids. And she's not the only one. Through a quirk of fate, a bunch of the other female partners end up pregnant at the same time, which means the dynamic has flipped. And now the firm suddenly has to reshape the way it works around baby feeds and part-time schedules in a way they've never had to do for the male partners. And it's an awakening for Liz. She's suddenly aware of how much is at stake for her career and for her personally, and also how important her actions are for the women around her and those who will follow. Former Sex Discrimination Commissioner Liz Broderick is my guest on Curveball. So those formative years at the law firm galvanised Liz Broderick for a life of action. She becomes Australia's longest-serving Sex Discrimination Commissioner before moving on to start her consultancy, Elizabeth Broderick & Co. I'm Kelly Reardon and this is Curveball, the show where great leaders let us in on the moments that have shaped them. And in this case, we're speaking to a leader among leaders. Liz Broderick feels comfortable in a room full of powerful people because that's where the work gets done. She walks into male-dominated industries and teaches their leaders how to make real change for people on the ground. Case in point, she stood up to the Trump administration about reproductive rights. She's worked with the UN, the Australian Defence Force, universities and governments across the country. And that sense of justice has made her a bit of a specialist in going places other people just won't go. Liz Broderick, welcome to Curveball.
Thanks very much. Wonderful to be here, Kelly.
Look, you've done so many amazing things over the years, it's hard to know where to start. But take me into the room when you first told your boss at that law firm that you were about to start a family. What was that conversation like?
It was an interesting conversation. Actually, it was a day that started like any other day. And that morning I had one of my lawyers, and I was only running a small team of lawyers at this stage, probably about 8 of us. One of the lawyers came in. She said, "Guess what, Liz? I'm pregnant." And I was, "Fantastic. Congratulations. When will you take parental leave?" And then a few hours later, around lunchtime, the next lawyer came into my office and said, "Liz, you'll never guess what? We're going to have a baby." "Oh, congratulations. When are you taking parental leave?" And when the third one came the next day, and what they didn't know was that I was also pregnant, we had 50% of a legal team off on maternity leave at exactly the same time. So I knew at that point I needed to have a conversation with my managing partner to actually, share the good news, but also try and chart a way for the future. And one of the things that I've learned, Kelly, is never just go with the problem. Always try and go with a solution. So I went to see the managing partner at that time to tell him how well the group was going. Oh, and by the way, 50% will be on maternity leave or having their babies one day after the other. So we will need to reinvent the way we work. But I'd already come up together with the others with a plan about how we would reinvent just the way we delivered services, because we were all professional people. None of us wanted a diminution in service, but we knew we'd have to do it a bit differently. And that took us really on a journey into flexible work. And remembering this is the early 90s, so at that time, flexible work was not ubiquitous.
And this is incredible because, as you say, the timing is interesting. We've sort of had a wave of feminism in the 80s where we said, women can do everything. And then in the 90s, we kind of realised it's actually hard to do everything all at the same time. For many of you, it was your first child as well. So did you know you could restructure things? You kind of don't know what you don't know before you're a parent,
That's so true. And for every one of us, it was our first child. So we didn't know what being a mother was like. This was all new territory. But interestingly, we decided that we wouldn't ask permission. We'd just do. And then if someone had a problem with us, they could come and see us. So what we decided to do firstly was we decided we'd need more administrative support if we weren't all going to be in the office, as we had in the past 5 days a week. So I still remember we decided we'd get a new junior secretary and we put the case for that. And I was looking through a stack of CVs and about halfway through I came to Michelle. Now, Michelle had been a secretary for 2 weeks, but she'd been a nanny for 6 years prior to that. And with those credentials, we decided absolutely she was on our team. So that was the best thing I think we ever did, because we then worked out between those who were working full time and those who wanted to work flexibly, how we were going to share work between us. And we had an arrangement that, look, if you couldn't get childcare and you needed to be in the office for a particular client meeting or whatever, you could bring your child in with you. And we took over one of the matter rooms and we set up a number of cots. So ordinarily this would be a room full of documents. We put the cots in there, and I still remember interviewing a general counsel in the room next door. And he said to me, "Oh, is that a baby's cry I can hear?" I said, "I don't think so. This is a law firm." Meanwhile, Michelle's trying to, manage with the babies in the next room. So, look, we had some funny times, but you know what? We realised that we didn't set out to change the world. We just wanted to make it possible for, and particularly women, to both work and care. Because I knew exactly what that felt like, because, this was my first child as well. So I didn't want to just continue on in the way I had before. That's what we set out to do. But we realised that out of small things, big things change. And that sent us on our journey.
How much strength was there in the fact that you were a collective of women instead of just you alone going in there? And how much was it that you were all, you're all educated women with, a certain level of income, I imagine, where you can make things kind of nicer on the home front or easier in some way, get a cleaner, have, possibly have nannies, have help in some way. Is it trickier for women who don't have that level of education or expertise or negotiating power?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, we already had a strong voice, and hey, we were 50% of a legal group. If we decided, well, this can't work, so therefore we have to make a choice between work or family, then I suppose the organisation risks 50% of this legal group heading off. So we did have a level of collective power, there's no question. And I was a partner by that time as well, so I had a strong voice in the partnership. I couldn't agree more that it is much more difficult where you're in a role which is maybe also a more junior role. You don't feel you have positional authority. You need that job. And also you don't have the economic resource to buy in services at home. So that's why I think where we've come to now, which is where flexibility hopefully is much more ubiquitous across all types of workplaces at all levels, that's a positive. But I never forget that I am very privileged in that I can buy in services in a way that so many other women can't.
I'm interested also to hear your experience in terms of, what impact it had on your husband's career. My own husband and I, we were working at the same media organisation when I became pregnant with my first child. And, we had moved up the ranks together as sort of junior burgers, and we were in kind of middle management jobs at that time. It was me that had to go on leave, and then me to try and, negotiate my return into the workplace. I wasn't allowed to stay in my same role. I wasn't allowed to job share. I had to be moved out. I lost 20 grand off my salary. I worked in the same organisation, my husband, and he didn't have to have those conversations. And I'm just interested in your insights around, how your husband had to navigate that or not navigate that, and what that means for the dynamic for women everywhere.
Yeah, my husband at that time was working in a big investment bank. And you're right, he didn't have to negotiate those conversations because we decided that I would take the initial period of leave. So I think it would have been way harder for him to actually create the change that I was able to access in my particular firm. So that was for the first 3 months. But my husband and I suppose, as the kids grew and particularly as they started to go to school, you realise you need then blocks of care, which in a way is even harder. So my husband actually has taken a step back from his career. He always wanted to start his own business, which is what he did. And then he really took over primary caring role with the kids and also running the household, which in a way worked for us as a couple. But the fact is that it is very difficult for men often to access flexible work. Now, the fact is it's been difficult for women as well, and women have paid a huge penalty, as you said, Kelly, in terms of their economic ability and their ability to be promoted. And those men who also in the past have accessed flexible arrangements have also paid that penalty. In fact, when I was a Sex Discrimination Commissioner, I led what at that time was the largest review into discrimination, pregnancy discrimination and discrimination against men who had taken parental leave at the birth of their children. And I found widespread discrimination against both women and men. Interestingly for men, even if they took less than their annual leave entitlement, the fact that they were taking a piece of leave which had the word paternity leave attached to it was what led to a diminution in, advancement opportunities and training opportunities and whatever. So there's no question that that's still alive and well. I mean, is it as alive and well now? Flexible work is becoming more ubiquitous in many areas, not all areas, because essential workers, of course, find it difficult to work from, other locations. But I think there is flexibility in rostering systems in most organisations now.
Let's go back a bit. What made you want to become a lawyer?
Well, it's interesting. I think I wanted a role where I was engaging with people. I always had a strong sense about fairness and equity, and maybe that was because I was born an identical twin. So, right from the get-go, if my twin sister got a present that was better than mine, I knew the world was not fair and we needed to do something about it.
Share a womb before you were even here, right?
Yeah, exactly. And she was a lot bigger than me, so I probably got the slim pickings in the womb. So maybe I was set to kind of redress that inequality once I was born. But yeah, so I've always had a strong bent towards social justice and equity and whatever. And law seemed to be, an extension of that. Having said that, I did a computer science degree with my law degree because I grew up in a household where my dad was very involved with technology. He was the first physician to introduce a new medical discipline here in Australia called nuclear medicine, which was imaging technology to detect, cancers and tumours. And so I grew up in those surrounds, also engaging with people who were really at a vulnerable point in their life. They used to come to our surgery to find out whether or not they had what essentially could be a terminal illness. So it was engaging with them there, but also a love of technology. So that's why the first time the university offered this combination of computer science and law, that would be in the late 70s, I was able to be one of the first students into that combined degree.
It's an unusual combination, particularly I think for a woman at that time. You went into, I think, the first law firm that you worked for, you weren't quite sure if it was the right fit, but you eventually moved to a firm called Blake, Dawson, Waldron, which I think is now called Ashurst. What were you working on there?
I went to that firm because prior to that I'd been working in London, and I came back from London thinking, you know what, I want to use both my law degree and my technology degree. And they were a law firm that was quite progressive at the time. They were offering a job for a lawyer who had a deep understanding of computers and computer science because they'd started to understand that with the rise of, at that time, the mini computer, So it was almost moving to desktops, but the mini computer, that would transform the way we delivered services, legal services. And they were looking for a lawyer who might help them, innovate around that. So I was really attracted to that role. I went in and essentially it was me and my boss, who was an academic actually, from one of the universities. And we had so much fun experimenting together. And then the dot-com boom came along, and it was at that time I was able to go out into what was called an incubator at that time. That was so much fun as well. So it took me in a direction away from black letter law. I would have been a terrible black letter lawyer, Kelly. It just wasn't me.
I find this fascinating. It's very revolutionary to work because the law is not known for being particularly progressive, let's face it, right? It's an industry that's quite archaic in a lot of ways. So to be working on such interesting technological advancement in the law must have been fascinating. I think you wanted to become a partner of a firm. Were there any speed bumps on the progression towards that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as I said, I moved away from black letter law, but I started to grow a practice which really was at the intersection of technology and law. So it was about the delivery of services. And we were starting to experiment with very early forms of rule-based systems, or what now AI-based systems. So this is the early 90s. This is before artificial intelligence and other things, machine learning had come along. And we were really putting the hypothesis that people would in the future take legal advice from an intelligent assistant, so some kind of technology application, as well as human lawyers. So we didn't ever see these assistants overtaking human lawyers, but we thought it would allow people to access high quality legal services at a much cheaper cost. And I suppose bringing my social justice bent and recognizing that if people don't know what the law is, it's hard to have a strong democracy. I was really determined to do that. So I started to grow a practice in that area. But when it came time to evaluate me for partnership together with my colleagues, I didn't fit into the evaluation boxes because I really wasn't a black letter lawyer. And the question, I suppose, for the partnership at that time, and this is probably in 1994, was, well, was I contributing in a way that was at partnership level, or was partnership only for mainstream black letter lawyers? And the first time I know I went up for partnership, there was huge running debate. Oh, well, she's not a real lawyer or whatever. And then there were those who were more progressive saying, but she represents the future of law and whatever, so she's going to make a valuable contribution at the partnership level and build a strong client base. But first time round, my candidature was put to the vote and I didn't succeed. And then, like many of us, when you're rejected, then you reflecting on it, well, actually, is this the path that I want to go on anyway? And I spent quite a deal of time, thinking about that. And I was determined, no, being a pioneer is difficult. We're breaking new ground here. I will step up again and give it my best shot. And if it doesn't work second time round, then yeah, absolutely, I'll work out what else I'm going to do with my life. But I, by that time, had beautiful mentors. Most of them were male because there are not many senior female partners at that time. And to be honest, there's still not 50% female partners. But I had beautiful male mentors who actually saw the value that I was able to contribute and actually made my case at the partnership level. So when I came up for selection second time round, it was just, I was a shoo-in and it went through without any problems at all. But, it was an interesting process. But I'm so glad I did that, Kelly.
I'm keen to know a little bit more about that. What I imagine is perhaps the first time you've faced such a setback. I imagine, you're a clever person who's done very well at school and you've set off on this great career and you've, worked overseas and you've done all sorts of things. Was that the first real setback you'd had in your life?
I'm not really, I don't think. I mean, being an identical twin, in a sense, unless you've got parents who are quite strategic about that, everything you do through your life can be a competition. I mean, fortunately, my twin sister and I never went to the same school because I think if we had done that, if she got a higher mark than me in science or French or this or that, every one of those things would be a small setback, not of major development. But I suppose it does, if I'm looking at it in a professional context or a career context, it probably caused me to ask the question, am I good enough? And I know for many women, it's something that we ask ourselves quite a lot. We say, well, I'm not enough. And actually, I think, that's one of the great things about age, to come to a place where you know that who you are right here, right now, you have everything you need to create the change you want to see in the world. I've come to realize it's not about knowing more. It's not about being more strategic or networking more or any of those things. It's just stepping in and owning the power that I have right here, right now, and that I am enough. And I think, that setback there just caused me to reflect, well, how do I feel about that? Am I good enough? Those types of deliberations.
It takes a lot of courage to move through that, though, when you're having those internal dialogues that are saying, I'm not quite sure I'm good enough for this, am I not cutting it? I'm interested in, do you think that is a kind of a muscle that you have to flex at that moment, and have you had to draw on that at other times in order to get to a point like, actually, no, I've got something to contribute here. I am getting back on the bike and I am going to give this a crack.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I have to do that every day, to be honest, because the work that I'm doing, and particularly the work I'm doing now, I'm the keeper of literally thousands of stories of human suffering and inequality that I witness every day, not just here in Australia, but across the world, in my global role with the United Nations. And you know what? It's that bearing witness to what's happening today and to have hope, I think is just so important. So these are the muscles that I'm flexing every day. And, I would have learnt to flex those muscles on the journey of working in male-dominated environments and being excluded or being denied partnership or whatever. And then, I'm getting back on the horse, and absolutely I'm using the emotion that I have from other people's courage and the stories that I'm bearing witness to and holding. I use that as my fuel to really implement a strong systemic response.
You mentioned your dad earlier, and I can tell that you've got some of your fighting spirit and your pioneering outlook from him. What was growing up in your household like?
We had a very strong family cohesion. My dad, actually, he would have lost both his parents by the age of 10. And that, he still remembers going to school one day, he was waving goodbye to his mum. And then when he came back that afternoon at 3:00, instead of his mum waiting for him at the school gates, his two brothers were waiting for him. And his father had already died. So he had beautiful brothers who really raised him. And I interviewed him for a book once about his family life. And he said he thought he had the most lucky childhood. And I said, but Dad, how can you say that? At 10, you'd lost both your parents. He said, yeah, but my brothers stepped in and I always knew that I was important to them. And he lived in different houses. When they went to war, he went up to stay with a family in Mildura and then another who were, on fishing trawlers, and spent time on his early life there. But he recognized firstly the value of family, and also he was an optimist. And I think those two things he brought into our family. My mum was a real activist. She wouldn't have called herself necessarily a feminist, but she was absolutely an ardent feminist in the way I think about it. Well, she grew up in an apple orchard in Tasmania. And then from there, she did her physio qualification and ended up in New York. And that's where she met my father traveling in the US. She was in Atlanta and other places, particularly following the polio epidemics and treating patients such as that. But together they were really strong partners in life. I don't think they ever spent a night apart from each other, which is so different to modern relationships now. I'm on a plane, or prior to COVID, a lot of the time and whatever. But so they were deeply connected. And our family, we were a small unit. We didn't really have any grandparents and whatever living close by or whatever. So it was our family who were really deeply bonded. And it was a beautiful family to grow up in, but it was a family where we shared all the domestic work in the house. So it didn't matter, genders or any of those things. Everyone just mucked in. So, yeah, I have to say I feel so blessed to have had the childhood that I have.
You mentioned your twin sister going to a different school. Was that a deliberate strategy by your parents to send you to different schools?
Yep, it was. So as I said, she was an activist and she was quite a lateral thinker. Dad probably would have just gone along with her, but she decided right from the beginning that competition was destructive on relationships, and therefore if, they had twin girls, identical twins, and we did look very similar, and we still look similar now at our advanced age.
Hardly. Not advanced at all. Your wonderful ripe age where you're killing it.
And we still live just a couple of streets from each other. When we bought houses, we decided had to be 90-second prams push, no more than that, away from each other. But she decided she would write to the Minister for Education, because you had to do that in those days. If you lived in a particular area, then you had to send your children to the school in the area. And she decided she'd write to the Minister for Education requesting special dispensation because she had identical twins and espousing her theories about competitiveness and whatever. So she managed to get permission to send me. I went to San Susi Public School and Janie went to Carlton South Public School. We used to swap schools, which was on one hand, so much fun, but on another hand, totally terrifying. And I still remember the day she did the Year 9 science exam for me, where I got second in the class. Thanks very much. Which was
hang
great.
on. I'm just cottoning onto this. You mean you actually did a swap where you didn't tell anyone?
Yep, we wouldn't tell anyone.
Oh my goodness, that's so naughty.
Dress up in each other's uniform, and she'd go to my school and I'd go to her school. And yeah, I still remember I had to go to her German class. Now, I haven't spoken a word of German in my entire life. And the teacher clearly thought I was Jane. So fortunately, one of her friends had identified by this time that I wasn't actually Jane, and she was able to ask me easy questions in German, which was ja or whatever was the appropriate response. So, but yeah, no, we had loads of fun in doing that. And actually, Kelly, just 2 years ago now, the last time we really did it was I was supposed to deliver the Australian oration at the opening of the International Convention Centre. So, it was a very prestigious address and whatever. And on the morning of the oration, I started to feel quite ill. But I decided, no, I'm going to push through this. And fortunately, I'd written my speech out. So I was taking Janie as my plus one. By this time, my husband's he's over all the dinners and everything else. So I arranged to meet Jane at the ICC, the convention centre, pulled up in the taxi. I'm pushing my way through all the taffeta and champagne. I can see her in the distance. She races over to me. She says, "Gee, Liz, you're not looking too well." And I said, "You're absolutely right. I don't think this keynote speaker's going to be keynoting anytime soon." Here, I shoved the speech in her hand. I said, "I need you to deliver the address." So she went from table 60 to table 1, sitting beside Gladys Berejiklian for half an hour, and then got up and proceeded to deliver the keynote address.
As Janie, though, was it explained to the audience?
No, at the end, she said, "Hi, I'm Jane Broderick. The last time I did this for Liz was when I did her Year 9 science exams."
This is
but
so
got a
great.
Standing ovation. I was able to watch it on the webcast from my bed, projectile vomiting at home. So, yeah.
Do you know what this makes me think of? All those times in my career, I've thought, if I could just clone myself right now. I'm overcommitted, I'm overworked, I've got too much on, the kids need me here, work needs me there, I need to be on a plane for this. You have nailed it.
Don't know if I've nailed it, but it's a work in progress. But it is very handy at times, I have to say.
From Dead Set Studios, this is Curveball, where we find out how the most interesting leaders thrive when the chips are down. I'm Kelly Reardon, and with me today, lawyer, consultant, and Australia's longest ever serving Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Liz Broderick. Liz, by the time you're in your 40s, you're a law firm partner, you're negotiating having a family and a career, and then one day you're tapped on the shoulder to become Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. What was that like for you?
Yeah, well, I have to say I was as surprised as anyone to see that, I was going to be appointed Sex Discrimination Commissioner, but it was a role that I'd always coveted. I thought if there was any job in Australia that I'd love to do most, it would be the role of Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And I have to say it didn't disappoint at all. I mean, it just was brilliant. The opportunity to work every day with people who want to create change in Australia was just an opportunity way too good to refuse, really. So, it was a very happy day when I was appointed. I was just so excited about it. And then to think about, okay, well, how will I connect with those who are living every day with inequality and understand those issues that I can bring to the table, bring to my advocacy with government and elsewhere. That was really the challenge.
Being a partner in a law firm, of course, is not really a walk in the park, but I imagine the stresses of a national and very public role as the Sex Discrimination Commissioner it puts you in a whole different ball game. How did you manage levelling up to that?
It does put you in a different ball game, and I wasn't used to public life. I mean, even as a partner in a law firm, you can live your life privately as just, Joe citizen, so to speak. Whereas all of a sudden, when I spoke, I was speaking as the Sex Discrimination Commissioner. And that was actually quite a difficult adjustment, particularly in relation to the kids and everything else. And you're reading about yourself in the media, either positively or negatively. So that took a bit of getting used to. But I suppose I also realised, though, that this was an amazing opportunity for change, and that I needed to use media and the nature of public life to drive the impact that I wanted to see. I think over time I became better at that, but early on it's quite a terrifying experience, and also experiences like appearing in front of Senate estimates. That was a whole new ballgame for me as well, Kelly, and just how to do that in a way where you didn't lose your cool, you weren't emotional, you were very evidence-based, because I realised early on I wanted, to ensure a particular persona in public life. And for me, I didn't see myself as a radical activist. I absolutely believe in the power of radical activism, and there's a role for that. But my role is more to work within the corridors of power in an evidence-based way, but to help people shift and change and to really build gender equality there, but through maybe a more measured and considered approach.
And do you think that it's the big ticket items like the paid parental leave scheme that are the biggest game changers, or are there the little things, the things that women were telling you when you went on that listening tour around Australia when you first started in the role, that would really make the difference? Like, how do you straddle those small changes versus the big, pieces of legislation that need to happen?
The small changes are what makes you powerful in advocating for the big changes, really. So when I went on the listening tour, I travelled the length and breadth of Australia. I spoke to as many diverse women as I could. So I spoke to women who were working on farms and pastoralists, women in abattoirs, women in corporate environments, lesbian women, Indigenous women, women of culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds. I tried, older women, young women. And every place I went, women would tell me their stories, and their expectations for life, how that had either been delivered or not, what were the barriers that were holding them back. I mean, they shared the most, heartfelt and intimate stories with me. And I think, as I said previously, that's the fuel that enables me to be a strong advocate, because when I stand up to advocate for change, such as the paid parental leave scheme, it's not just Liz Broderick speaking. It's Liz Broderick fueled by the thousands of instances of women who have not been able to spend time with their newborns because of a financial imperative. So it makes you really powerful, I think, when you speak like that, and no one can challenge the stories. because you were there. You didn't just see a piece of data on a page. You sat and felt the full emotion of that story, and you can't unsee, unfeel, unhear those stories. So I think those individual instances are really important in stepping up and leading change at either the national or the global level.
What about what's going on with sexual harassment at the moment in Australia and this sort of reckoning that we're having? How much of what you're seeing in 2020 and 2021 concerns you or makes you feel like we haven't come far enough? What are your thoughts on what's happened in Australia across the last year?
Look, I am deeply concerned about sexual harassment. I've led 15 major reviews from the military through to private sector organisations like Qantas and Rio and companies like that, looking at culture and particularly sexual harassment. And I can tell you it's alive and well in 2021. And of course, Kate Jenkins' detailed work has also showed us that. But it was so interesting, Kelly, because when I came in as the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, I went back and spoke to Dame Quentin Bryce, who'd been a previous Sex Discrimination Commissioner. I went and met her in Government House. She was in Brisbane at that time. And she said to me, look, Liz, dust down the files that are down in the archives on sexual harassment, because I did a lot of work on that. She said, but you'll need to continue that agenda. And similarly, when I handed to Kate Jenkins, I said, look, we've got strong prevalence data here, but Kate, you need to keep shining a light on this particular issue. And Kate's done a brilliant job doing that. So some of these issues are so very difficult to shift. I mean, at the heart of sexual harassment is a power imbalance. And we're seeing a new cultural reckoning, though, because I think more and more women have chosen to speak out. Now, some have chosen to speak out at significant personal cost. And, not just the trauma of the incident, but the trauma of bringing it to the attention of management and the public has fallen on the shoulders of many women. And I just want to honour their contribution to moving our country on, because it's women telling their own story in their own words at a time of their own choosing, which is creating a cultural reckoning and a change across Australia. And it's just so interesting to see how, whereas in the past, companies would, okay, sexual harassment's wrong, et cetera, they are now investing significant time at senior leadership level, board level, CEO level, senior management level into really understanding the dynamics of sexual harassment and what a good organisational response looks like. And that's what we need.
You came up with things like the Champions of Change project, and really what you're having to do now is become very good at the art of persuasion. You've got to go into boardrooms across the country, into government, into the corridors of power, as you mentioned, and have a strategy for convincing people that things must change. What's your tactic? Share with us, what your secret skill is around negotiation.
I don't know if it's a secret skill, but what I've learnt in all my work is if you can connect with people at a deeply human level, so you put the positional authority to one side, you just connect as two human beings who are sharing the planet. That's the best chance of influencing people. So just to give you a couple of examples of that, the Champions of Change, which started very much with men, we now have more and more women coming into that strategy. But I wanted initially those men to actually take on the issue of domestic violence as a workplace issue. Because now we know, particularly through COVID, not only is domestic and family violence increasing, but your house is now our workplace. So any violence happening in your house is now happening in our workplace. So there is a single continuum for safety, that we need you to be safe at work and safe at home, because it's part of one continuum. My question was, how would I get the men to engage with this? Because they were engaging around promotion of women, women's leadership, pay inequality, but I needed them to step up on domestic violence. So I actually invited in Rosie Batty and another courageous survivor, Christy McKellar, in to spend several hours with the champions to talk about the human dimension. What is it like to be living in a violent relationship and be trying to hold down a job? And I still remember Rosie saying to the men, she said, look, prior to my son Luke's death, and you'll remember Luke was killed by his father. So prior to my son Luke's death, no one wanted to hear my story of living with violence. Now everybody does. And it spoke to the men about the fact that there were so many points where Rosie had spoken out to those who represent the system, but nothing had shifted, nothing had changed. And similarly with Christy McKellar, she told the story about how she was, sharing an office with another co-worker. She was leading a customer service team, and her husband used to ring and abuse her on the phone. And when he rang this time and said, you effing this and that, when she hung up the phone, the woman who was sharing the office turned to her and said, look, Christy, we shouldn't have to take calls from angry customers like that. And she just turned to this woman. She said, no, that was no customer. That was my husband. But in that moment, her co-worker didn't know what to do with that disclosure, so just continued to write on her pad or whatever. And Christy said she took from that it wasn't safe to disclose in the workplace. So there's so many things that come from the men hearing the lived experience and the personal story, because it starts to engage their hearts as well as their heads. And I still remember at the end of that session, one of a really senior chairs of a number of major ASX 200 companies here in Australia, he turned to Christy and Rosie and he said, look, may we have the courage to take action in the way that you've had the courage to come and tell your stories to us. And so it's a technique that I've used in so many areas with so many CEOs and, what we call national leaders from the heads of a military and police force and elsewhere. I want to bring them face to face with the human story, because that's how I get them to step up in a way that showing them and explaining to them all the data would never move them.
So you were in that big role for close to a decade, and then it's time for the next thing. How did you decide what that would be? Because in many ways, you'll never have a role as amazing as that, or will you? I mean, was that a question that you asked yourself?
It was. I asked myself, should I go back into executive life, or should I continue down the road of human rights and particularly women's rights and gender equality? And if so, what type of role would I have? I also wondered, exactly as you said, Kelly, have I reached a high point and it's downhill from here? Will any CEO or others take my call? Will I be able to earn a sufficient income? All these types of jobs that anyone in transition is probably asking themselves. And if I don't have, a strong label, will I still be able to have power? Those types of questions. So I decided, no, I was going to create my own kind of portfolio, if I could put it like this, and I was going to do work that mattered and also to have one or two anchor roles. So at that time, I found out that the United Nations, their Special Procedures Division, which is based in Geneva and works with the Human Rights Council, were looking for what they call special rapporteurs, so lead independent experts who would help lead their country visits, who would write to the heads of nation states, drawing to their attention human rights violations that were happening, who would set new normative standards on human rights across the world. And I thought, look, I'm never going to get that role, but I might as well throw my hat in the ring. So I did that. And I was interviewed. I still remember the interview panel, I think was 4 men and 1 woman for a women's rights position. You've got to love that. And I remember it was in Paris at that time doing the interview. And I remember saying to my husband, well, I don't think that went very well, so we can scotch that one. But then, interestingly, a couple of months after that, I was fortunate enough to be put forward as the president of the Human Rights Council, one of their preferred applicants for the role. And it's absolutely amazing because I see every day what's happening on women's rights across the world, and I have a role in advocating for different governments. So that was my kind of anchor role for my portfolio. And then I decided I'm only going to do work where I think I can drive impact. So I do 1 or 2 major consulting roles a year. I usually go in to interview the senior executive team, the board or whatever, because I want to know that, I'm stepping up with courageous leaders who also want to create change. I'm kind of at the stage in my life where, I'm realizing that, you're here for such a short period of time. And if you want to drive impact, you need to work with others who want to as well. So they're the types of roles that I do.
I mean, congratulations on the role at the UN. It's just unbelievable. Well, it's not unbelievable because you're fabulous, but it's just such a credit to your body of work across your career. You've found yourself in some prickly situations in that role. I think you were across the table from an angry Trump administration on the issue of reproductive rights. How did that play out?
Yeah. I am each week writing together with my colleagues to leaders of nation states and their ambassadors into the UN, pointing out things which are in breach of international law. And I still remember I wrote an official communication about the 11 states in the US who during COVID had shut down any access to abortion. It was seen as elective surgery. Therefore, it was no longer available. There was a curtailment of women's reproductive rights. So I wrote a very, structured letter pointing this out together with my colleagues. And what we found out subsequently was that this letter was actually being used by the Trump administration in the re-election campaign. So it was being used to re-elect the president and also in terms of his appointments to the Supreme Court in the US. So knowing that that was something that you did in that moment, which had that outcome, which was exactly the opposite outcome to the one you want, it's a difficult moment. But, reflection, Kelly, is I came and I have come now to understand that actually more than looking at any given impact, I have to believe in the truth, the value and the rightness of the work that I'm doing. I have to hold on to that and also ask myself, am I being faithful to the gifts that I've been given, the skills that I have in service of the needs that I'm seeing around me at the minute, rather than attaching, whether I've been successful or not to any particular outcome. Because some of the official communications that I'm engaging in at the minute are in deeply hostile environments. And actually that takes a lot of courage as well. So I've been using the muscles of courage and hope and belief. They're the tools that I'm taking with me and relying on every day at the minute in the work that I'm doing.
Can I also ask how you don't get overwhelmed by that? So when I imagine a big part of your UN role at the moment is to deal with troublesome countries, whether it's, China, what's going on in the Middle East, the Taliban, ISIS. I mean, there are so many kind of bad guys out there. And some of the material that you must be bearing witness to use your phrase from earlier, must be deeply gut-wrenching on a whole number of levels. How do you not let yourself be kind of weighed down by the pressure of that?
It is gut-wrenching. I mean, some of it is just pure evil. Prior to coming into this role, I don't think I ever thought about evil, but some of the things that I see, there's just no words to describe or understand it. And to be able to hold that and also hold for the possibility of change and hope it's really hard, Kelly. And I suppose I've learnt some techniques as I've navigated these roles. One of the things that the women's human rights defenders have taught me is that being well, both physically and mentally, is the ultimate act of empowerment. And in many countries of the world, it's the ultimate act of political defiance. So we will be well, both mentally and physically, because the movement's only as strong as each of us who make up that movement. So that's my commitment to myself. And I suppose the other thing I've learned is wherever I go across the world or even around Australia, I always ask people, how do you stay energetically replenished? How do you stay sane and positive in this environment? And just prior to the pandemic, I met a beautiful women's rights defender in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and she said to me, look, Liz, I often think about the trees on the African plains, and I remind myself that tree started with a seed, and then the rain came and the wind blew, some sunshine. There was a period of drought and flood. But she said, I remember that I'll do my part and I know that you'll do yours. And I think it's a really empowering kind of thing that I go back to. You know, each of us will do our part and others will do theirs. And we're part of a movement of hundreds of millions, hopefully billions of people who care about equality across the world, each of us doing what we can when we can. That's what creates change. So I hold on to those things. But having said all that, it can be really scary at the minute, Kelly, to be in a role
we're
like
not
mine.
living in a great world right now. There's a lot to be very concerned about.
There is. And even, you know, I see what happens to people who speak out in many regimes. You know, they're what we call doxing, so the publishing of all their personal information, financial information, red tagging, which, you know, makes them a target for execution, incarceration, torture, rape of their children. All these things are happening. And, you know, as someone who needs to speak out strongly and often on incredibly sensitive issues and have my signature at the bottom of, you know, very sensitive communications, it is a moment. And particularly when that particular nation then either speaks out against you, makes a formal complaint against you, you know that if you went to that country, you'd be at risk, possibly of arbitrary detention or whatever. It does wear heavily on you. So I absolutely have a regular practice as well. I'm a regular meditator. I use what I call body wisdom. So I regularly check in with how I'm feeling. I'm deeply connected to friends and family. And all these techniques are ones that I've learned over time as a way of staying safe and recognizing that I might be helpless and powerless to create change out there, but provided I feel powerful within, that's an important part of creating change and leading in the world.
I feel like this is a great week for you to give me this as a reminder, because I've really fallen off the wagon in the last probably month around self-care. Someone close to me just today said, Kelly, you're heading for that burnout route again and you have to stop. And I'm like, I can't because I've got all these things. Blah, blah, blah. And I feel like I do feel like it's a particularly female burden. You know, it's a stereotype in a way, but we do tend to carry the load of a whole lot of stuff, whether it's the pressure at work, the pressure of the family, the constant spreadsheet of who's got to get to what football game and what hockey game and what music practice. And it can be, you know, mothers, we just immediately, we're the first person to let down all of our self-care. Have you had moments where that has gone for you, or have you always been so disciplined around that self-care?
Not at all. It's a work in progress, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you around particularly mothers. And I think just helping each of us see that actually if we don't care for ourselves, then everything else falls apart anyway. So we have to, ironically, in pursuit of your women's empowerment, if we don't recognize that self-care, it's not a selfish act. I think many of us feel, oh, well, if I put myself first, that's
exactly
selfish.
how I view it.
Yeah, it's actually the preservation of the gifts you were put on the earth to deliver to all of us. So it's about preservation of what you can offer the world. That's why we need you, Kelly, to really put your self-care at the highest level, because without that, then, you know, nothing else flows. But it's better to take it away from yourself and say, well, do I care about, you know, that the kids are going well, that the family's intact and all those things? If I care about those things, then I need to put self-care at the top of my list. And also, I'm determined now to walk at my own pace. I'm not running at the world's pace anymore. I am walking at my own pace. And you know what? I'm going to be okay with that. And actually, if I look at those women that are the most influential in the world, they have enormous presence. They're not frenetic. They're not off racing. They have a really strong core. And, I think being can be as effective as actually doing. So that's what I'm trying to do now, more to transition to that.
Because you have been such a doer. I mean, women like us are impatient to get things done because we see the work. Like you're sitting there at the UN seeing this great vast volume of work and thinking, I have to run at this at 100 miles an hour. But I guess it's a what is the best way to run at this?
And I don't have the answers at all. I can honestly say that. But I also think there's something in this nub of, moving away from believing that any given action will create a given impact or outcome, because I think if you're wedded to that way of thinking, then as an extension of that, the more actions you take, the more great outcomes you're going to get.
I'm completely addicted to that. Like I'm a state school kid who had to sort of, bring myself up and do everything for myself. So my whole mindset is you got to do it for yourself. You got to make it happen. It's not going to happen unless you make it happen. But you're right. It's a really bad habit.
Well, not necessarily. I think the personal responsibility that you're talking about there is it is so critical. But I think you can put a lot of pressure on yourself, because if the outcomes that you want don't actually eventuate, then you're looking at yourself as a failure. So, I mean, even in my world, I could say, look, why does violence against women still happen in this country? Why can't I do something about it? Does my work matter? Do I matter? So you can kind of go down a slippery slope on
You've got
that.
to celebrate those incremental milestones, don't you, in that? It's that growth mindset stuff that we try and instill in our children and aren't so great doing ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And what is the one thing, just before we wrap, that you would love to pass on to your children about leadership?
I think I'd say that leadership is a human activity. So I suppose as a young woman, I always thought, well, I could never be a leader. I'd look up at these really, distinguished, powerful individuals and say, well, that's never going to be me. Look, they've got all that positional power. And what I've come to understand is that anyone can be a leader. It's a deeply human activity. It comes from the way we walk in the world. And at its heart is dignity and respect and vulnerability, that vulnerability is strength. If you walk in a way which respects our shared humanity, that's for me the definition of leadership. The leaders that are doing it well in every setting are ones who believe in shared humanity. They walk in the world in a way which is an exemplar of that. So they're respectful. They never strip anyone of dignity. They build up others. That's what I'd say. So try and connect with people at a human level, and that's what will make you a good leader.
Well, Liz, thank you for being such a great leader in our country and increasingly across the globe. So many women so grateful for the work that you do, and thank you for coming on Curveball.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Curveball's a production of Dead Set Studios. I'm your host, Kelly Reardon. This episode was produced by Grace Pashley, and thanks to Carl Hitchmo for studio assistance. The show's executive producers are me and Rachel Fountain. And we'd love you to show Curveball a bit of love. Wherever you're listening, just go ahead and click follow. And maybe you're listening on the bus right now or you're on the train, so just lean over to the person next to you and grab their phone and just make them subscribe to Curveball as well. And I'd love to hear from you about your Curveball story, or if you have a guest you think we should talk to, send me an email at hello@deadsetstudios.com. And we also have a LinkedIn newsletter. So if you want your inbox to have some great tips from the country's best leaders, just follow Kelly Reardon on LinkedIn.